about me. I was given an introduction there. So until recently, I was the Chief AI Officer, and I had the privilege of standing up from scratch and setting up the group AI initiatives for what is the biggest events company in the world. That meant putting in place things like the operating model to how do you orchestrate the various kind of tools, platforms, data, architecture, etc., across a large number of countries, and also figuring out what the approach would needed to be for things like AI literacy to take every single person in the organization along with us. So it isn't just one-off training, it's a continuous exercise. In parallel to deciding on the architecture and the platforms that we needed to either stand up, combination of buying and building, and making sure that we could celebrate wins quickly by picking use cases to go after that made an impact to the wider organization. So all of that was truly fulfilling. And since then, I've gone on to set up my own organization to help other companies to unlock value from AI. And it truly is an end-to-end consultancy to make sure that organizations got the right capabilities to support them. And this conversation today is really to allow everybody here in the call to take away tangible, practical insights. And there's a simple strategic framework to help kind of like figure out how you navigate this, where do you start and what do you go after. And none of this is theory. This is all kind of like real world experience from myself, essentially. It's kind of tried and tested, and hopefully you get some value from it. So I'm going to start with the kind of like the very kind of like the starting point, essentially. As I said, there's from the top, there's a lot of kind of still hype in terms of what you can achieve from generative AI, how mature it is, and so on. But the reality is that a lot of these generative AI applications and the underlying LLMs, the large language models, they're general technologies. And therefore the hyperscalers are not telling you what use cases to go after. It's up to the industries and the businesses to work out what to go after. And it's important not to go after the most important use case from the outset, because you're going to make mistakes. You gotta figure out what kind of stabilizes and learn as you go along, essentially. But it is important to be really ambitious from the outset and then take small steps, break off small chunks, figure out are they the right things to go after, and then you pivot and you learn as you go along. And the other thing that's super important is like, don't worry about if your company hasn't started doing anything or if you're doing lots of things, because sometimes there's a bit of a rush into buying technologies. But the reality is that, from my experience, that whilst the technology and the architecture for AI, it's super important and it can be a real catalyst for driving transformation. It's only about 20% of what organizations need to truly unlock value. The other 80% are the things that are pretty difficult to do. And they're things around driving up AI literacy across the whole organization. Change management is often hugely underestimated, and things like continuous communication. And then importantly, kind of like providing leadership from the top, from the board and the executive. So there's kind of like walking the walk from leadership. And then encouraging experimentation, making sure that everybody's kind of they've got access to tools to try things out, because the best way to find use cases is by leaning into your workers and by kind of allowing them to explore with suitable guardrails about what's worth going after. And that's mapped back to the strategic framework we should go against, so that there's control and order and coherence across to our wider organization. And then when it comes to customers, to outside customers, instead of just productivity use cases, it's really important to validate with your customers that they actually want what's being put in front of them, so that you're not investing time and money and energy into things that people don't actually want. So all those things come together, they can be brought together into a simple framework, which we'll go through in a few moments. I thought it was worth just speaking a little bit to impactful business functions in terms of where you get the biggest bang for your buck. And when I was working in Informa, I had we'll say a bias to go after sales and marketing, because I felt that there was just huge potential out there, just because the way those particular the life cycles in marketing and life cycles in sales work. And we spent a lot of time kind of establishing are there kind of solid use cases across all different parts of the life cycle. And we went after that because they met the criteria for what we were trying to achieve. The other one that you can't see there because there's covered over is around customer operations. and product and R&D. And this is kind of industry agnostic. And it was interesting because the kind of slide that I'm showing here, that this is a survey done by McKinsey some time ago, which is by interviewing hundreds, if not thousands of companies across North America in relation to where organizations, where are they spending money and where are they seeing impact in relation to generative AI use cases. And there is a real kind of like, we'll say a lot of people moving towards sales, marketing, product R&D, and also engineering as well. And to my mind, as I say, that this is true for every single industry. There's obviously other places to go after, but in my own personal experience, you can move the needle quite quickly in those particular areas. And if you are just starting off, it's really important to celebrate the wins quickly and early because it builds confidence and trust by those around you before you start going off to bigger, chunkier things. And when you're moving from prototypes to pilots to scale up, essentially, because moving from pilots to scale, it's pretty challenging. All day today, you will have heard about multiple different use cases that you could go after. So I'm not going to speak in specific terms on this particular slide around it because you, as I say, you will have been hearing about it all day. But I put a number of up here, which kind of relates to customer-facing use cases, internal facing use case, and then the combination of the two in relation to kind of business processing, automation, things like that. But there is a plethora of really high value, high impact use cases, which are kind of like in a lot of cases, they're proven, they're credible, they're effective, and they're measurable. They can make a measurable difference inside organizations. Again, a lot of these I've put up here, they're industry agnostic, and some of them have got different levels of maturity depending on the industry and depending on the part of the world that you're in. Now I'm going to go into the strategic framework. And this is where I believe that this is something should be practical and useful. Now it's a high level framework. Now, if anybody would like the more details behind this, they're welcome to reach out to me. But in the interest of time, I've just kept it high level. So I'm going to step through this. It's kind of referenced as a roadmap here, but the reality is you go through this cycle multiple times. You do it kind of like as layers, essentially. You go through one pass, not spending too much time on any of these stages. I'm going to step through them briefly. So from the outset, and this is literally from day one, it's really just being deliberate and thoughtful and strategic and thinking about what should your AI objectives be in relation to your themes. At Informa, I kind of frame them around improving customer experience because that will ultimately lead to better customer outcomes, which will ultimately lead to revenue generation. And then the other side of it, which is the internal ones, is around productivity. Because if you can make a meaningful difference around productivity inside an organization that you can capture, it will make a difference to your profitability as an organization. But it's only important to go out, the use case you go after in the themes, they must map back to your company's vision, mission, and the overall business outcomes you're seeking, because otherwise there's a misalignment and it creates confusion and problems and things can just drift and then just become problematic. But it's super important to think about who needs to be involved. And it's important to get the data and technology teams involved early, but it isn't just data and technology teams. Many people need to be involved. And it's not a case of rounding up hundreds of people. You've got to be thoughtful again about who to involve, when to involve them, and how to involve them all the way through. But again, it's not spending too much time on any of these stages. It's just getting going quickly, taking a real iterative approach to it. On the bottom left, we talk about building a rich picture. This is when you've got your AI objectives established. In parallel, you're thinking about, well, what does your AI strategy look like? You're not going to know what your AI strategy looks like until you're a bit further down the path. So when you get into building specific pictures around what you should go after, it's like this is getting really specific about who are the audience that you're going to go after. Is it going to be external users? Is it going to be marketing? Is it going to be sales? And then getting really tight about, is it going to be, for example, is it all of marketing, or is it going to be just demand marketers or event marketers or different type of marketers? So getting as precise as you can, because then you're able to start breaking down into, well, what are we trying to do for these individuals and these groups of people? You start getting into objectives in this more specific sense. And then you start getting into, well, what are the things you need to stand up in terms of technical capabilities? Do you need new technologies? Are you going to augment what you've already got? Have you got the data? And this is when you start getting into what do we actually need to deliver on the promises that we're making. Then you cut across onto number 3, when you're getting into more specific use cases, you start getting into acceptance criteria and you start getting into the groups of the use cases. And then you've got a sense of, well, how do you kind of prioritize this? And it's going to be, and it could be on levels of productivity efficiency, and you may put different weights against it. We'll say at Informa, we had about 10 different variables with different weightings. And one of the ones that was most important to me was like, if there was a difference that we could make with the use case, where let's say it was around sales, that would affect 4,000 people. So if we can make a 10% efficiency on 4,000 people, that is enormous. Whereas if we can make an 80% efficiency from a function that only had 10 people in it, it didn't make any difference. So it's been really thoughtful about having a simple framework to decide what use cases to go after. And you don't need to go after the entire use case. You can break it into small chunks, which I would certainly advocate. Then if we go up to the top one on number 4, in parallel to thinking about who you're going to solve the use cases for, what your AI objectives need to be considered, you should be thinking about the technology, what data assets you've got. Because in a lot of organizations, data can sometimes be in silos, sometimes it can't be that, it's not that well organized. And it's only worth going after use cases if you've got relevant, useful, usable data. Because if you don't, there's no point going after it. And then in addition to that, if you can't actually measure the efficacy of a use case by using a mixture of quant and qual information, then you haven't got a baseline. And if you haven't got a baseline, it's very hard to tell if you're doing well or not doing well. And I'd advocate to be looking at different use cases if you can't measure it until you can measure it. In terms of architecture approaches, there's multiple different ways. You can basically outsource everything. You can have a hybrid approach. You can basically buy. There's multiple different patterns. You probably have heard today about RAG, which allows you to kind of have a lot richer information where you combine that with the power of a large language model. And the technologies they're evolving so fast. So my advocacy would be not to lock into any large ecosystem immediately. Take a step back and think about what have you got today? What do you actually need? Because the reality is to get started with this, you don't have to spend that much money. Even at large companies, the cost isn't the limiting factor in the early days. It only becomes a problem when you start to scale. As you're kind of looking at all these things, you've probably already begun to think about the individuals you need to move things along. And is it you want to start with a small team, depending on how large you are, and be really thinking about change enablement, not just for the team that are involved, but for anybody that's involved in the pilots, the betas, thinking about what behaviors they need to change. How are their workflows going to change? The 6th one, which is off the screen there, this is around looking at kind of governance frameworks, because governance about how you're going to orchestrate this, then you're getting into like the bias, the ethics, and it can be useful to have ethics board and certainly having about AI governance frameworks in place. And again, you can kind of layer this in. You don't want to get too sophisticated too early. On the bottom one around number 7 is around, whilst you're actually doing these activities and you're standing up prototyping, you can start thinking about, but how would we scale up? Do we have enough information and enough validation to warrant more investment in time? And it's important, as I say, to make this cyclical, to constantly go to revisit these things, because you want to move really quickly. You want to celebrate the wins. And when things aren't working, you want to stop or change or just move on to something else, essentially. So you're being really visible, communicating what you're doing. And when there are problems and things go wrong, that's okay. Talk about it. Let people know. Be completely transparent on what you're doing and how you're doing it, because it just helps to build trust across the wider organization. And if you want to take the wider company with you, you want to take every single person with you, because it isn't just about homogenous groups of people. Every individual organization will be at a different perspective in relation to how are they feeling about generative AI. Some people are really, really worried about their job. Other people will be quite excited about the potential, and they may already be using lots of tools. So it's kind of like, it's been really considerate and thoughtful about AI literacy all the way through. And it's a continuous exercise. And ultimately, it should land up into job competencies, into job profiles with yearly training on an ongoing basis. So as I say, this is a simple framework and there's more detail behind it, but hopefully following something like this, it allows you to take a consistent, coherent approach. And what this kind of framework doesn't talk to, but it is important. And again, it depends on the size of an organization, whether it's a small one, medium, or large one. If it's a large organization, you need to think about the operating model, whereby how are things controlled in terms of data flows, in terms of architecture, who makes decisions, who's allowed to drive the innovation? Are there multiple teams working on different technology stacks? How do they all come together? How are learning shared? How's experimentation done? And it can be quite useful having different innovation groups across larger companies so that everybody feels that they have a say. They feel that they're getting involved, they're getting invested. It brings interest and it brings enthusiasm. Responsible AI is it's kind of a topic in its own right, and it's important to be thinking about this from the outset because it becomes more difficult to retrofit things like responsible AI. And when we talk about responsible AI, it covers different facets. It covers like the ethical aspects of it, bias mitigation. You'll be familiar with a lot of the large language models are based on largely kind of English-speaking countries, and therefore there's already kind of biases built into those. So being alive to that and thinking about how do you mitigate that, and making sure your workforces are really have an understanding about what bias mitigation actually means. Privacy and security is super important. And this, when you kind of get into, if you're handling customer data, being really open about what it's been used for and how it's been used, and doing the absolute bare minimum with genuine kind of PII, essentially. And again, having a workforce that understands what's allowed and what's not allowed, and making sure there's oversight and there's controls measures to make sure that there's appropriate usage in time. And what can be powerful as well is making sure that there's complete, we'll say, tracking and transparency. So it's really, really clear what happened and when and how over time. So you've got traceability all the way through. And then human oversight, super important, will be for some time to come. There's still a lot of issues with large language models in relation to bias and hallucinations and so on. So therefore, making sure you're not handing over complete controls to control to computers at the moment. AI literacy, I've talked about that. So embracing learning from the outset is super, super important. And don't underestimate just the heavy duty nature and the amount of kind of, like we'll say, time and energy that goes into change management. It is really significant. And thinking about that upfront, about how to organize it, will help ensure that you're not caught on the back foot. And as I said earlier on, encouraging experimentation is important because everybody feels like they can play around with things and bring ideas to the table. But it's got to have guardrails around. They've got to be allowed, they've got to understand about what are they allowed to do. For example, you don't want people using a generative AI tool from the internet where they take a private company report and they put it into that, because they might have found that they got a really useful summarization, but they may not be aware of that they've just trained the next LLM. So they've taken confidential information and then caused a problem for your organization. So there are multiple kind of challenges that need to be kind of like faced into up front so that you can allow and embrace experimentation. I talked earlier on about just communication. So it's super important to just constantly tell people what you're doing, how you're doing it, and what the objectives are, and how it aligns with your company's strategy, so that there's clarity, there's consistency, and there'll be continuous engagement from teams. And this is kind of like, I look at it as taking a top-down approach, so that the board and the executives, so they're trained consistently, so that when they're talking about using AI to help the company, that they're walking the walk, they're being seen to use the tools so that it has more integrity behind it and it's not disingenuous. And then a bottom-up approach, so that you have, we'll say, innovators across all the different areas of the organization, because if you've got champions inside your organization every level, they'll have more credibility rather than a top-down organizational approach with just individual leaders just saying that what people must do. If their peers are working on those things, they're more willing to share learnings and to learn from each other. And that all kind of touches into clear communication about just being upfront about what's happening, when it's happening, what's allowed to happen, and what the expectations are. Because when people hear about productivity savings, they may start worrying about their job. So just be open, be honest, don't hold back. When it comes to technology approaches, again, it's quite a deep topic beyond the kind of scope of this, but from the outset, it's important to think about your data assets, about what have you actually got, who's got access to it, and then information that you don't have, because you might find that you could have a really powerful use case if you could buy some data from elsewhere or get some freely available data. So don't underestimate the importance of data, because AI without data, it's not very powerful. When it comes to the architecture, there, as I said from a while ago, there's multiple different design patterns you use. You don't need to spend a huge amount of money to figure out what architecture you're going to use, because whatever you decide to put in place, you're going to change it next year. The space is moving so fast. It's just important to just be really nimble and flexible, and look at things like just loosely coupling things so that you're not locking into giant ecosystems. It allows you to kind of keep an eye on the market and just change as your business changes and as different technologies come to the market. On the bottom left, I've talked about the operating model in terms of it's useful to have like a clear framework, a simple one, to determine, well, when should you buy something off the shelf versus when should you build something with your team? When you build something, there's benefits there, but you're locking into for the long term. So it's taking a simple framework around what is your approach going to take. And then similar in terms of your resources as well, but do you upskill your team? Do you hire more people? Do you use external suppliers? And usually the right answer is it's a mix of all of those things. On the bottom right, then we get into kind of data and AI governance, and there's significant overlap. And it's super important because if you've got data flowing through your platforms from multiple different systems, it's important to know, well, where does it come from? What's the provenance? What are people allowed to do with that? And to have complete visibility and transparency across all of that. And if you plan from that from the early days, it helps to enable that when you do start scaling up, that you've got the infrastructure and the frameworks in place to help enable your organization to scale. And that is it from me. I'm very happy to take